Hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our Brain Awareness Week webinar on the EBV study that was recently published from researchers in Harvard University. It certainly caused quite a stir in the MS community, and lots of people have been asking questions about it, wondering what exactly it means. And in order to answer those questions, we have brought Dr. Claire McCoy and Dr. Lisa Costelloe together for this session to chat through exactly what we've learned from this and what's to come. So Dr. Lisa Costelloe is a consultant neurologist in Beaumont Hospital. She's a graduate of UCD Medical School and has been working in Beaumont Hospital since 2012. She's chair of the neurology in Beaumont Hospital, and she is an honorary senior clinical lecturer in both RCSI and in Trinity College Dublin. Dr. Claire McCoy is a research scientist and a senior lecturer in immunology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and she leads a research team investigating the impact of the immune system in multiple sclerosis with the aim to understand how manipulation of the immune system may be therapeutically harnessed for the treatment of MS. So we're going to hand over to Dr. Claire McCoy in just a second, who's going to run through some slides to discuss the topic. We do welcome your questions through the chat function or Q&A. We might blend some of those questions into the presentation. We might hold them to the end. We'll see how things go, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can in the hour. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Claire McCoy.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Aoife, for that introduction. As she said, my name is Dr. Claire McCoy, and I'm a research scientist and lecturer at the Royal College of Surgeons. So I'm here today to explain the connection between Epstein Barr Virus, or EBV for short, and multiple sclerosis. So really what we know to date is that MS is a very complex disease, and there has been associated risk factors for developing MS. And really it appears to have been a mixture of your genetic makeup, but also environmental factors. And that's what we've kind of known to date about how people become susceptible to MS. But recently, and as Aoife suggested, there was a paper published in Science back in February that really provided compelling evidence that EBV, the Epstein Barr virus, is the single most important trigger for developing MS. Now, this caused a wave of excitement, not only in the scientific community, but also for those patients with MS and also neurologists. So it's very exciting, and it's good to be able to explain it here to you today. So I suppose the first question is, well, what is EBV? So EBV is the Epstein Barr virus. It's actually a human herpes virus, and it's transmitted via saliva. And EBV, it infects epithelial cells, and it infects B cells, which are a type of immune cell in your body. And actually 95% of the world's population have been infected with this virus. So actually most of us have come across EBV, and most of us have come across this in early childhood. So in developing countries, that's typically before the age of 4, but in developed countries, that's more in adolescence that we will have come across EBV. And this diagram really here explains it quite nicely, and I hope you can see my arrow, but you can see EBV here, the viral particles, they infect the epithelial cells. So the epithelial cells are really the skin, the internal skin barrier that's found in your oral cavity. And then it goes on to infect the tonsils. And as you can see, EBV loves B cells. That's its cell, which it's always trying to get into. And once EBV gets into those B cells, what it does is it kind of hijacks the B cell machinery, and it starts to replicate, and it produces more daughter viral particles. So we have an immune system that's very clever. We have an immune system that helps us kill and get rid of EBV. And so most of us who come across EBV are asymptomatic, and we can clear it very effectively. And the two ways we do that here, you can see, is a B cell produces antibodies, and these antibodies are kind of this Y-shaped molecule here. And these antibodies can then go back and bind to the EBV and stop it reinfecting our cells. So that's one way our immune system can get rid of EBV. The other way is that we harness our T cells. That is another type of immune cell. And these T cells can recognize infected B cells. And these T cells have the capacity to actually kill that infected B cell. So another amazing mechanism that we have to kill EBV. However, EBV is very clever, and EBV can stay latent in our B cells, and it can actually reside for our lifetime in our B cells. And upon situations in our life, it may become reactivated. So 95% of us have EBV. We've all cleared this infection, but a subset of individuals, EBV can go on and cause MS. So this paper that was published in Science needed to prove, well, does EBV cause MS? And the only way really to be able to do that is to find a cohort of individuals that don't have EBV, basically that have never been infected. And you can imagine if 95% of the world's population have come across EBV, that's going to be very hard to do. But anyway, first of all, we must find a cohort of individuals that don't have EBV, and then we must go on to show that these individuals, when they do get EBV, will then go on to develop MS. So how did this study do this? Well, this study was published by scientists at Harvard University in collaboration with the US military. And the US military had access to over 10 million individuals over a 20-year period from 1993 to 2003. And basically, when someone enters the military, they have a blood sample taken, and then every second year they have another blood sample taken. And so Harvard University gained access to these blood samples, and they kind of worked backwards. And what they first asked was, of these 10 million people in the military, how many of them had MS? And actually 955 of those individuals had MS. And then what they were able to go is they were able to go back to the very first blood sample that was supplied, and they were able to show that of those 955 individuals, only 35 of them were EBV negative. So they had never been infected with EBV when they entered the military. Now, this was a really rich cohort because we now had 35 individuals who were EBV negative. And what they did then was they tracked all their blood samples and identified when they did get EBV, because most people do come across EBV. And what they showed was that when they did get EBV, 7.5 years later, they went on to develop MS. And you can see this very nicely in this graph, where this cohort of 35 individuals who are EBV negative is shown here in the green at, say, 18 years of age. But then when they came across EBV, 7.5 to 10 years later, they went on to develop MS. So obviously we need to have a control group, and a control group, basically they looked at a similar amount of individuals who also got EBV, but they didn't develop MS. So it's really interesting from a scientific point of view. Well, they all got EBV, so why did some people get MS and other people didn't? And so what they went on to show was that those individuals who did go on to develop MS had an increase of this marker called neurofilament. And neurofilament is literally a marker of damage that's caused to the central nervous system. And so you can see here in this graph that those individuals with MS had a higher level of this neurofilament marker in their blood, whereas those individuals that didn't get MS didn't have this marker. So that's one bit of evidence. But also what they showed was that those individuals that did go on to get MS, that they had a higher number of antibodies. They had a higher number of B cells that were producing antibodies to try and fight EBV. So they had higher levels of these antibodies in their blood. And really the key finding from this study was that EBV infection causes a 32-fold increased risk of developing MS. And so really just to put that into context, this is quite astonishing. And really it's kind of the highest risk factor that we have to date for the development of MS. So for example, back in the day when they were trying to find an association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, those individuals who smoked, they identified that they have a 25-fold increased risk of developing lung cancer. The risk of developing MS after an EBV infection is higher than this. It's actually 32-fold increased risk. So really showing that this discovery is really quite key into our understanding of the causal reasons for developing MS. So a really important point to make here is that of course, there's lots of individuals who come across EBV, but not everyone who has EBV will go on to develop MS. So EBV is necessary, it's the trigger, but it's not sufficient to get MS. And there's lots of other factors, such as your genetic makeup and those environmental factors that I talked about at the beginning, which will help increase the susceptibility to MS. But what's interesting here in this figure, it's quite nice, like why do some of these individuals, or why do some people then go on to get MS, or what are the mechanisms from a scientific perspective as to why EBV would cause MS? And so there's 3 theories that you can see here. And the first theory is this one called molecular mimicry. So remember I said that EBV infects B cells. So EBV is in blue, your B cells in gray. And then your B cells produce antibodies. And antibodies are wonderful because they then bind to the virus and get rid of the virus. However, a recent study has just shown that these antibodies that are generated by your B cells to fight EBV can also cross-react with, you can see the myelin here that protects the neurons in the brain and spinal cord. So what we think is happening is that we raise these antibodies. Someone who has MS has more of these antibodies, and that these antibodies, even though they're trying to fight EBV, they can also cross-react and cause damage to the myelin in the brain and spinal cord. And this is what we call autoimmunity. It's where your own immune system is damaging your own body. There's another theory where EBV, because it loves B cells, it causes those B cells to really proliferate, to grow in larger numbers. And again, people with MS do have larger numbers of B cells that produce antibodies. There's also another theory that EBV causes B cells to cross into the central nervous system. So normally our immune system works in the periphery, it works in all our peripheral organisms, and the central nervous system really doesn't have much of an immune system. However, in people with MS, these B cells do tend to traffic into the central nervous system, and they could be causing damage here in this way. So what are the next steps? Why are we so excited about this, and why is it really interesting to consider this study? Well, Moderna are the people who generated the messenger RNA vaccine for COVID. They have recently begun a phase 1 clinical trial for a messenger RNA vaccine for EBV. And this vaccine will act as a kind of preventative step. So a vaccine will obviously prevent someone developing EBV and then may prevent the development of MS. So that's one next step. There's another step where we have Atara Biotherapeutics are currently in phase 2. And they have this clinical trial where they're developing experimental T-cell therapy. And basically, remember I told you there's 2 ways to get rid of EBV. One of them is through T cells, activating T cells that can kill infected B cells. So this therapy literally harnesses individuals who already have MS. It takes their blood, it takes out their T cells, and it amps up their capacity to be able to kill those B cells. And then those T cells from an individual are given back to the individual who has MS. And we hope then that they're able to recognize those B cells that are infected with EBV and kill those B cells. So that's a really exciting avenue as well. And so I think that just leaves me to conclude. Yes, here's all the references if anyone is interested in these studies, but that just leaves me to conclude that part of the webinar.
Aoife, you're on mute.
Apologies, 2 years in and I'm still doing that. Claire, thank you so much for that, and thanks for so clearly kind of communicating as well. You know, I suppose it's so difficult sometimes for people to actually grasp what any of this actually means, and you know, it's very scientific language kind of being put out there with these articles, and we're trying to make sense of it. So that was really useful, and thank you so much. Dr. Costelloe, I might just bring you in there as well. I know that there has been great excitement in the MS community in terms of these findings, and I'm just wondering from a clinician's perspective, what are your thoughts on this? How do you think it might impact people living with MS? And I suppose now and maybe into the future.
Okay, thanks Aoife for inviting me, and thanks Claire for that very comprehensive summary. I should say I'm not a scientist either, so it was nice to have it outlined in a very clear way. I mean, I suppose from a doctor's point of view, and especially a doctor with an interest in MS, we've long known that there's an association between the Epstein Barr virus and multiple sclerosis. So I suppose what's different and exciting about this study, you know, is that it's so scientifically robust in that it was a study conducted over decades, looking and with a huge sample size of over 10 million people, so a huge amount of data, and the results are very compelling. I mean, the difficulty with proving that EBV is a cause of MS has always been the fact that MS is a relatively rare disease and EBV is a very common virus. So the vast majority of adults have been infected with EBV, and it's not like you get EBV and then you very quickly develop MS. It can be, you know, several years later the neurological symptoms develop. So I suppose what's exciting about this study is, you know, the very robust conclusions that they've drawn, which I think it's fair to say that infection with Epstein Barr virus clearly is one of the things that contributes to the development of MS. So I think obviously it's not the only thing, because vast majority of people with EBV don't get MS, and I think it is important to say that. Yeah. But I suppose in genetically susceptible individuals, it is a clear trigger. And there may be other, as yet, you know, unknown or known contributory factors as well, like vitamin D deficiency or smoking or other things, you know. I suppose in terms of the implications of this for people living with MS at the moment is a little bit less clear. Certainly many patients have been saying, can I take anti-EBV medications? And unfortunately at the moment there aren't any effective antiviral medications for that particular virus. And, you know, there's a lot of interest in this because in addition to the association with MS, it is also associated with certain cancers, albeit rare cancers. But to date, we don't have any effective antiviral that eradicates the Epstein Barr virus. To Claire, there are, you know, initial studies looking at immune therapies specific for EBV infected B cells. We already use B cell therapies in MS, and they're highly effective drugs, things like ocrelizumab and more recently ofatumumab. But I suppose they're wiping out, you know, very broad spectrum of B cells rather than just B cells that are infected with EBV, which may be the relevant one. So I think there are some preliminary studies now looking at ways of targeting EBV specific B cells, and that, you know, may have therapeutic implications for people who already have MS. I mean, the broader question, I suppose, to definitively prove that causality or that a virus causes a disease, you have to eliminate the virus and see, does that eliminate the disease? So in order to do that, you'd be looking at developing vaccines. And I think it's really exciting that Moderna and probably other companies are going to look at developing or trying to develop EBV vaccines. It raises its own questions as to who should be vaccinated. Should it be everybody, given that this is picked up, you know, by most of us in adolescence? Would you be looking at, you know, giving the vaccine in childhood? I think obviously, you know, there's a road to looking at viruses or to looking at vaccines, particularly when you're talking about giving them to very young, healthy people, that, you know, they have to be very safe and very robust. We have to be sure that they, you know, are, you know, significantly reduce the contraction or risk of the relevant virus. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns, but I think the fact that this study has been published and the data was so compelling, it's acted as a springboard for the scientific community, but also the pharmaceutical companies to kind of go back and look at this again and, you know, try and develop specific therapies and try and develop a preventative vaccine. So I think it is very exciting.
Thank you. So one of the questions that did come in advance of this actually asked about the role of EBV after diagnosis. So obviously it is something, you know, it's involved in the development of MS in some way, shape or form, but there was a question as to whether EBV played a role in in kind of the symptoms of MS? So does EBV flare back up, and does that cause MS symptoms, do we know? Or, is there a role for it past that point?
I mean, we know that in certain individuals, EBV remains latent in the body, specifically in B cells, but possibly in other areas of the body as well. I think that we have less of a clear answer on that specific question. There have been a number of very small studies looking at the association between, levels of EBV antibodies at the time of clinical relapse, or looking at EBV and associating it with disease activity on MRI. And there have been mixed findings in those results, to my knowledge. Some studies found maybe a possible association with disease activity in MRI, others didn't. But I probably, it's reasonable to say that all of those studies were very small, and maybe some of them not very scientifically rigorous, and certainly not comparing to controls or randomized control trials or things like that. So I think that's a little unclear at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. McCoy, I might just ask you as well, one of the questions that came in advance, really, I suppose it was somebody who was asking about if there are any measures that they can take to reduce the risk of their child contracting EBV, because as people living with MS, we know that we, most likely, based on this, have EBV already. And if EBV has such a big role in the development of MS, then logic would tell us that if we can prevent our children from contracting that, then maybe, would further reduce their risk of ever developing MS, if it was something that was it would ease that concern. So can you maybe talk on that a little bit, and explain to us if there is anything that people can do, or maybe just chat about the likelihood of encountering EBV in childhood?
Yeah, so EBV is transmissible via saliva. So that means it's contracted by kissing, by sharing utensils, food utensils, sharing cigarettes. That kind of is the transmissibility of it. I suppose the fact that that occurs in childhood and adolescence is simply because that's common to how we live in that stage of our life. So it's a very topical question, isn't it? Because that's a very, I think EBV, the fact that 95% of the world's population have it, means that, and people don't even know if they have it either. So being able to restrict those kind of activities would be a huge challenge, and I think might have other associations that mightn't be warranted either, so
yeah, it's I suppose difficult as well to control, the actions of, as you're saying, it's adolescence really, and do you kind of prevent people from hitting like normal life milestones and things like that too, yeah. And exploring their own lives at that point to prevent something. So really, I suppose we are maybe looking towards the potential of a vaccine here, and maybe that might be something that down the line may be beneficial.
Exactly. And I think just to really point out to the person who posed that question that it's still so rare to develop MS. Like, everyone gets EBV, 95% of us do, and we clear it completely fine. It's still a very rare outcome to develop MS. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. There was another question then around the vaccines. I'm not sure which of you might like to take this question, but it was around how quickly, I suppose, the COVID-19 vaccines came to be. And I suppose there's that kind of want in the community for a vaccine like this to become available. So how quickly do you think something like this might come to market?
Oh yeah, no. First.
I mean, I was going to just, in a very general sense, I think the pandemic obviously has taught us how quickly things can accelerate when everybody puts their mind to it. And, when scientists collaborate with each other and share data, internationally. And, so that's encouraging. The mRNA vaccine technology is relatively new. It had been sort of in development for types of cancers before the pandemic. But obviously with the onset of the pandemic, it's sort of accelerated. So I would be hopeful that lots of people will now be working on this and will hopefully collaborate. But I suppose even we know even with the COVID mRNA vaccines that, they don't completely reduce your chance of contracting COVID, but what they do is they reduce your risk of getting serious COVID or being hospitalized with COVID. You can still carry it or have mild or asymptomatic infection. So I think probably what, we'll be trying to do initially will be to prevent EBV associated symptomatic disease or infectious mononucleosis, rather than, I think it would be very, very difficult to create a vaccine that completely prevents everybody from getting EBVs. But I'm not a vaccine expert, but I think you can even see in the last couple of months how, there's more conversation around this, and there's, phase 1 clinical trials in vaccines, but also in other things. So I will be hopeful, and I think it will benefit not only, people, it's not only beneficial in MS, but in other diseases too.
Yeah, I think it's very, like, I think that trial, so it's in phase 1, but it's completing in June 2023. So that's not far away. So it'll be really interesting to see the results from this. And I do think there is such an interest now in this virus because of its capacity to cause other diseases and cancer and stuff. So, and also we've had such great efficacy with the HPV and cervical cancer and also hepatitis B virus and stopping liver cancer. So people already know that these viruses cause these certain cancers. So hopefully if it does come around, there won't be that same fear. We know that these do work.
Thank you. A question here as well to find out if EBV is what causes cold sores.
Cold sores are caused by the herpes simplex virus, which is a first cousin of EBV, but not EBV. So they're within the herpes virus family. CMV is in the same family as well, but it's not EBV, no.
And there's another question here, I suppose, as well. It's around that, trying to identify it, I guess. So is there a blood test to see if somebody already has contracted the EBV virus?
Yeah, I'm sure you could check for that in the blood. You could check an antibody level in the blood. There's different types of antibodies. The IgG antibody tells us that we were infected, for example, with EBV at some point. An IgM antibody tells us that we have an active EBV infection right now when the blood test was taken. So most people would have an IgG antibody against EBV in their blood. Yeah, that's something that we can check, but you would expect that to be positive in almost everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. A question here as well to ask, down the road, for those of us that have MS, do you think this could help us?
Well, hopefully, yeah. I mean, I think as we alluded to, I think this has prompted, it has been a lot of EBV work ongoing anyway internationally, but I think this has probably, added some fuel to that fire. Not just looking at preventative vaccines, but looking at more EBV specific targeted therapies that could potentially be of benefit to patients who already have contracted EBV and have MS.
Thank you.
So hopefully, but I mean, there's nothing that we can prescribe right now as an anti-EBV therapy, obviously, but again, hopefully within time there will be. Yeah.
Thank you. So Dr. McCoy, I might come to you with the next question. So somebody was wondering about the study that was done, and their question was, has any similar study in another country been conducted with similar results?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So I suppose the unique aspect of this study was that it was 10 million individuals in the military. And so the US are very good at kind of collaborating with researchers and scientists to make the best of this really valuable, they're sitting on all these blood samples. So that's an amazing resource. I mean, we try and do these kind of studies here, but they can be very small, especially in a country like Ireland. It is very hard to get those large numbers to be able to do such experiments. So then you'd need to collaborate perhaps with other places in Europe. But look, I think there has been ongoing studies, as Dr. Costelloe alluded to, that we have known that there is this EBV association. There has been other studies showing that EBV antibody levels are higher in MS patients. EBV has been found in the brain lesions of those with MS. So there has always been that association, but nothing, I don't think we can ever, address how the huge amount of work these guys already did in that 20-year period, I don't imagine that ever being replicated. It might be now in smaller cohorts. I imagine that smaller scientific communities will start showing that association in whatever samples they may have.
And just in relation to, I suppose, existing data sets and things like that, and why we initially thought EBV had a role in MS, can you maybe speak to that a little bit in terms of, I suppose, just to give some context to why we initially thought this in the first place?
Well, I suppose, we've always known that MS is a complex disease in terms of cause. So we know that there are certain genetic susceptibilities, and there have been very robust genetic studies, particularly in recent times, that have identified, certain genetic signatures that aren't enough to cause MS, but there's some other factor. So the obvious thing, I suppose, would be some sort of infection, or, either an infection or a toxin in the environment that acts as a trigger in a susceptible individual. So I think that's kind of what started the initial exploration of viruses. And obviously EBV is one of the commonest viruses that people contract in the general population. So, they have looked at antibody levels started off looking at antibody levels to EBV in people with MS versus people who don't have MS, looking for the presence of virus in brain tissue on autopsy samples, looking for the presence of virus in B cells isolated from the spinal fluid. So I suppose that's sort of where it came from. And there was, an early clear signal that even though most of us have EBV, nearly everybody with MS has been infected with EBV, and antibody titers tend to be higher in MS patients in some studies and things like that. But I think that's sort of where it started from. And we know that infectious mononucleosis, which is the symptomatic illness a minority of people get in adolescence from EBV, we've long known has been a risk factor for MS. But I suppose it's just going back to that, the fact that MS is rare and EBV is common, in order to prove this a causality, or that something is causing a disease. There's a number of different points that you have to kind of prove definitively. And to do that, you need a huge sample size, and you need to do it over time. So I suppose that's what's so impressive about this recent study, is that they've managed to prove causality on almost all of those points. The only one being that you need to prove that if you get rid of EBV, you get rid of MS. So that's the remaining one to be seen. But I do think, there's other questions that I think people can go back and look at in smaller numbers. You don't necessarily have to have 10 million samples to advance, the research. It can be done in smaller groups. I mean, I thought what was interesting is, obviously in this cohort, they were predominantly men, which is the opposite of most MS cohorts, which are predominantly women. I can't see really how that would necessarily impact, but I suppose it's just something to note. Again, they didn't go into the sort of breakdown very much of the different types of MS, whether relapsing, remitting, or primary progressive, or so on. And, is there other factors there that are EBV related or not, as the case may be? I think there's a number of different questions that you can kind of ask and look at in more detail. And you don't necessarily have to have enormous studies to do that,
Yeah, and from a scientific perspective then as well, like Lisa's absolutely right. The scientific community will now be trying to understand, well, why does EBV cause certain individuals to get MS and not others? Like, what is the mechanism behind that? And you can do that with very small sample numbers. So that's what that's where places that doesn't have access to those samples will be looking at that very easily.
Thank you.
And do the people who pick up EBV at a later stage, do they have a different type of MS? Is it more active? Is it a more progressive phenotype? Do we know that? I mean, we didn't get that information from that cohort, but I'm sure that even within that study group now, they're going to be going back and teasing out further information where possible. And, it just is a jumping off point for lots of other questions, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it's like, does it make a difference how long maybe you've been infected with this? Does it make a difference to MS and your MS journey, and how that goes, I guess. There's a question here as well about, I know you had mentioned that EBV is also linked with types of cancer. So a question here about, does the fact that you have EBV and have developed MS increase the chances of developing cancers linked to EBV? Dr. Costelloe. Sorry, we might.
I should say I'm not an EBV expert, but I would think the answer to that would be no. I mean, all of these things on their own are pretty rare, and you know, the certain EBV forms of cancer would be probably even rarer than MS. Some of them, you know, and some of them aren't even seen in Ireland very commonly, but you know, in sub-Saharan Africa. Oftentimes, EBV associated cancers can develop in the context of other alterations in the immune system. So lymphomas in particular, you can be EBV associated, or in people who've had transplantation or things like that. But I don't, to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't imagine that just because you have MS means that you're at increased risk of getting some other EBV associated cancer, which, you know, I would think not. I think we probably would have a sense if that was the case, you know, somebody would have seen that or made an association, or, you know, oh, you have MS and you also have Burkitt's lymphoma or something that's vanishingly rare. I think that's probably unlikely.
Thank you. And actually a question now, when you mentioned that, a question did come in advance as well that asked about any potential kind of benefit of having EBV. So they had mentioned that with chickenpox, you're better off to have had chickenpox than not, in some, you know, for some things, so that there's benefits sometimes. So since, you know, we have the downside of EBV with MS, is there any, or are you aware of any benefit of EBV?
I'm not aware of any benefits to it. I mean, oftentimes with viral infections in general, I know that if you get them at a later stage, or if you get them as an adult, they're a lot more, you know, you're a lot more sick than you would be if you pick them up as a child. And certainly, I suppose people that get EBV as kids oftentimes are asymptomatic, or just have a minor head cold or something that's just passed off as one of those things in kids. Whereas if you're a bit older and you're in adolescence, you know, a minority of patients can get infectious mononucleosis, which is a little bit more of a big deal in terms of symptoms. I don't think there's any advantage. I mean, given that most of us have this anyway, I don't think there's any real advantage to picking up EBV. But I don't think any of us would miss it if we were vaccinated against it and didn't get it. I mean, if that's what.
Yeah. So another few questions here in the chat box. And somebody is wondering, if antivirals become available for EBV, can a person with MS take it to alleviate symptoms? Lisa, we might go to you with that one as well.
Difficult to say. Probably not, I would imagine, but most symptoms of MS are due to MS lesions or plaques that have already occurred. So whether it's in the spinal cord leading to pain or spasms or bladder difficulties, whether it's in the white matter tracts leading to fatigue or memory problems, or in the optic nerve causing reduced vision in an eye. So most of the symptoms are due to lesions that are there already. So probably taking a drug against a virus that may have caused the MS isn't necessarily going to get rid of areas of abnormality that are already there, similar to most MS drugs that we're using right now as disease-modifying therapies. You're taking them not necessarily to alleviate your symptoms or to get rid of problems that are already there, but you're taking them to reduce the chance of developing more lesions in the brain and spine. So I wouldn't think of them as necessarily symptomatic treatments. Whether or not they have a role in disease modifying or relapse reduction or reducing disease activity going forward, I think remains to be seen.
Thank you. And Lisa, we might just stick with you now for the next question as well. Do you think B-cell therapies will be used more in the treatment of MS due to these research findings?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think B-cell therapies are being used more and more in MS anyway. And obviously they're the only group of therapies that we can use in patients with primary progressive MS. I mean, they are obviously not without their issues. They predispose you to infection. They can reduce the efficacy of vaccines, in particular the COVID vaccine recently. So I suppose we don't give them to all comers. You know, they are reserved, I suppose, for either patients with more progressive disease or more highly active disease. But I'm not sure really whether we'll necessarily increase our use of them right now, just based on this study, given that, you know, they affect all B cells, you know, not just EBV specific B cells. So I suppose, you know, you do have to prescribe them within the prescribing guidelines and very much tailor the side effect profile and weigh up the risks and benefits based on the patient. But I think what is interesting is, you know, scientific groups looking at EBV specific B cell therapies on the basis of this study. So I think that's what's going to be interesting, hopefully, going forward.
Thank you. So there's another question here from somebody wondering how effective is valocyclovir against EBV? They're taking it for a chronic viral infection and it helps with chronic sore throat. They're not sure which virus it's helping. I'm not sure which of you might be happy to take that question.
So valocyclovir isn't effective against EBV. It's used against other members of the herpes virus family. Similarly, acyclovir and foscarnet, they can be used, but it's not an anti-EBV drug.
Thank you. So, Claire, we might just ask you as well. So in terms of, I suppose, where the research goes from here, so there's so many, as you said, this is a great jumping off point and there's so much. What do you kind of think will be, if you were to, I suppose, if you were to take something from this, what do you think will be kind of the short and medium term kind of studies that will come from this that you think will be most exciting?
Yeah, I think what Lisa was saying there, I think that the T cell therapies is hugely exciting. So now, you know, that's very personalized therapy where you can take somebody's own T cells. Then what you do is you mix their own T cells with EBV peptides in a dish. You kind of super amp up the T cells to be really, you know, active, and then we can put them back into the patient and then they go and find those EBV infected cells, B cells, and they're able to directly kill the EBV infected B cells. So that's always being, you know, tweaked and harnessed, and it just depends on what peptides you mix with them. So that's always continuously ongoing. So that is a very exciting field. From my perspective, I mean, I'm just dying to look at, I look at macrophages. It's a different immune cell, but they play an important role in antigen presentation and all that. So from my perspective, you know, wanting to get my hands on some EBV peptides that we can start looking at all the processes we look at. And I imagine across the world, anyone that's interested in MS research will be doing exactly that, looking in their own pathways and their own mechanisms, how EBV affects those pathways. So
thank you. So, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a time for the MS community to be very hopeful as well. And with this, so like that, the various scientists who are working on the different parts of all of this are going to be looking at this and how it's relevant to their work, and we'll be looking at hopefully some positive developments from there. Well, I think we might just finish up with that, unless you have any kind of other burning thoughts that you would like to add at the end of the session. I just want to thank you both again so much for coming to join us for this, and to everybody who has joined us, to everybody who has submitted a question, thank you very much. Dr. Costelloe, Dr. McCoy, is there anything else that you might like to add before we go?
Not really. I mean, I think, you know, the take-home message for me is that this is very positive. The more we know about what causes this disease, the more we can be targeted and focused on you know, in our endeavor to ultimately cure or prevent the disease. So I think, as I said, I think this is going to be a jumping off point, you know, for an augmented phase of EBV associated research and hopefully therapies and possibly a vaccine in the future, which would be amazing. Yeah.
Incredible. Well, thank you both again very much for joining us for the session, and thanks also to Claire Lyons from the Information Advocacy and Research team as well for putting together the slides for us for this session. Thank you everybody for joining us, and have a very happy Brain Awareness Week.
Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you. Bye.
thank you.